Hi, folks. I'm here at the National Library of Norway with Ola Albert Rønning Nordby, historian and supervisor of the Medieval Collection at the National Library, talking about Landslova and the exhibit dedicated to Landslova here. Now, what will people see when they come and visit this fantastic exhibit?
So we wanted to make an exhibit here to mark the 750th anniversary of the enactment of the Landslov, which was introduced in 1274 as the first kind of law which governed the whole of the Norwegian kingdom, so all the lands under the Norwegian crown except for Iceland. That happened 750 years ago, and in the exhibit here we want to show some examples of manuscripts of this law, but also of the kind of written culture around it and the legal culture around it. So we show manuscripts from the church liturgical books, and we also show saga manuscripts showing how written culture kind of establishes itself and is used by the crown and royal power as well. And then we show the old law manuscripts. We have just one complete manuscript of the provincial laws prior to the Landslov left, but we show that as well here. And we try to give not a complete picture, because that's not possible, but an interpretation of the written culture which made this law book possible.
And it's very well arranged, and you really get a sense, I think, of the difference as the material culture changes over time. I mean, we fairly late in some pretty early manuscripts here. So what is the historical background of Landslova? How does this come to be? How is it adopted? Who is the impetus behind it?
Yeah, so before the Landslov is introduced in 1274, there are regional provincial law codes for different parts of Norway. They are, at the time of the Landslov, they are written law books, but they start as oral legal traditions. And it's a legal tradition which is practiced at an assembly, at the thing, and then which is then written down someplace, late 12th century, early 13th century maybe. So that's the kind of starting point, that you have different laws in different parts of Norway, which parts of these laws go very far back. Some which is more recent. But what happens is that King Magnus VI, the so-called lawmender, who was king of Norway from 1263 till 1280, he decided to make one law book for the whole kingdom. So all these provincial laws would be made identical, essentially. You still have manuscripts addressed to the provincial assemblies, so they kind of look like they are still provincial, but the content of the law books is now identical for every province. Yeah.
He's a federalizer.
Exactly. You could say that.
Yeah. Now, who is producing a manuscript like this? I mean, I think often our picture of medieval writers is clerics, people associated with the church, but this doesn't strike me as exactly a church activity, or is it?
It is both, I think. We have some manuscripts containing the law which we know have been in church ownership. We have manuscripts here which has been owned by monasteries. We have manuscripts in our own collection here at the National Library, which we know has been owned by bishoprics. But we also have manuscripts which has been much more secular in use. So we have a manuscript at the exhibition here, which has been used by the Løgmaður, the king's kind of legal representative, in the town of Tunsberg in southeastern Norway. And I think experts tend to agree that this manuscript has actually been written by the Løgmaður himself. So he's been writing it down. So we have both a more ecclesiastical manuscript, but also more secular ones, and I think most of them, the majority, are more secular in nature. Yeah.
And is there regional differentiation in addition to chronological differentiation between these manuscripts?
Yes, so the main regional differentiation is that each manuscript is addressed to one specific regional assembly. So it will say, like, for the Gula thing, here's your law, right? And then there's, of course, also a lot of smaller differences between the manuscripts. There are quite a few manuscripts of the Landslova, 39 complete remaining manuscripts, which is
That's astonishing.
not bad.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
in what period is it in effect?
It's in effect from 1274 and until 1687.
Okay.
But before that, it's also translated into Danish. So in the 16th century, there are a lot of Danish administrators who start making their own translations. And then in 1604, the King Christian IV makes an official Danish translation, which is also printed. So then you get an official Danish version. He calls it Christian IV's law, or we call it that today, but it's actually a translation of the old medieval law.
Oh, that's very interesting. That kind of continuity is preserved. Of course, you can imagine that probably Danish administrators in the 1600s could not read the Old Norwegian in the 1200s.
That was part of the problem, yeah.
Yeah.
They were looking at these old law books and they were not understanding what it said, and they were also a bit weirded out by the fact that the Norwegian law was still written by hand in manuscript, which was by the 1500s and the 1600s a bit weird.
Right.
Yeah.
A little bit obsolete.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about some of the particular manuscripts of Landslova that are here.
So in this exhibition we have picked out 3 manuscripts. As there are a lot more, there are 39 complete manuscripts, but we made a choice here to pick manuscripts that are both visually interesting to look at, but are also telling some kind of story, right? So, so behind us here is a manuscript called Codex Hardenbergianus, which it's got its name from an owner in the 16th century, a Danish noblewoman called Helvig Hardenberg, who bought it in Bergen. The manuscript itself is a version of the Landslova, which is perhaps the most decorated, beautiful manuscript. It has illuminated initials introducing each separate section of the legal text.
It is beautiful and very colorful.
Yes, it is. It's quite wonderful.
You have to imagine this was expensive to produce.
Very expensive, yeah. So I think one manuscript like this would take 20, 30 calf or something like that to make.
Yeah.
That would be a lot to a Norwegian farm in the 13th century. So this was a striking object, yeah.
And years of work.
Yeah, absolutely, and also very specialized artistry here. It is also, I think, one of very, very few Old Norse manuscripts which has gilding with actual gold, which this does. So what we're seeing here is the beginning of the last proper section of the Landslova, the section on thievery or thieves. And that is the first rule in that law is quite interesting because it's the rule dealing with how you should punish theft, which should be punished quite strictly. You punish it by whipping, but you can by paying the king you can get out of the whipping punishment. But if you can't do that, you have to be whipped, and then eventually, if you if you're a repeat offender, you get branded on your cheek with a key. It says. And then eventually you are hung if you keep stealing things. But at the beginning of the same rule, at the very beginning of the rule, it also says that if you are not able to work, if you're poor and you're starving and you can't get work, then you should not be punished if you steal food to stay alive. And this is clearly a principle taken from canonic natural law developed at European universities at this time.
Aslak was at pains to point that out in one of his videos from here. Yeah. And I'd like to point out something that's really nice about this exhibit relative to the manuscript is you have here, is this a facsimile of this manuscript that people can flip through?
Exactly.
I'm just going to, redneck zoom in on this for a moment.
So it's also always a problem when you exhibit books that you can only show one page, which is a problem we've been having.
Oh, this is a wonderful idea.
Making these exhibitions. So we, for this specific manuscript, which is so striking, we wanted to make to give the public here the chance to flip through the pages.
I love it. It's whose idea was this?
I think it was one of the people working in making exhibitions here, Martikina. I think Sandingen was the person that said it, or it was one of the designers, the exhibition designers.
Wow. I mean, it's a great idea. Well, talk to us about the manuscript we're looking at right now.
So this is a manuscript I was mentioning earlier, which has probably been written by the king's legal official in Tunsberg. This was the legal collection used by the king's legal representative. It contains a lot of different legal texts. It contains the Landslova, which is what we see here. We see here some chapters of the section dealing with violence, human inviolability. And then we have also laws containing what we call Christian law, which is like the parts of canon law which apply to the lay public. Then we also have the law for the towns, so a law for Tunsberg, the town of Tunsberg, and then we have a law for the king's retinue, his kind of court moving around with him. And then there was also a lot of legal amendments, so additions to the law which were made after the Landslova was enacted. So that came in 1274, and then in the preceding decades and centuries, there were a lot of additions to the law made by the kings of Norway, later the kings of Denmark and Norway.
Now, are these sort of case law, or is it broad principles of some kind, taxation or something?
They are both. We have some examples of legal judgments, which is case law. It starts in a very specific legal case and then establishes some kind of general principle in that way, and it has to be copied into the law book because it's useful to know. But then you also have more statutory rules which are made. The crown says we have to do so and so.
Sure.
Regulate wine trade in Bergen in this way, for example. And these legal amendments are produced way up until the 16th century, and we have new ones added into this book as they are enacted, basically.
And these marginal notes, are those by the scribe? They look later.
Many of them are later, yeah. I don't know if I am able to read any of these, but there are a lot of them in this book, and it shows quite a bit of legal practice here because it has a lot of annotations, it has a lot of comments on the law, fingers pointing to help you find the place you need to find. We also have some comments made on the law which are quite funny, not on this page but on another page. We have a comment made by the Queen Margaret, who was Queen of Denmark, Norway and Sweden, the queen who made the Kalmar Union. And a legal official is noting on the rule dealing with inheritance and the fact that you can inherit debt from a murder victim. And the Landslova said that you don't have to pay that debt. But Queen Margaret, she was not fond of this, and a legal official has noted in the margins that Queen Margaret did not like this.
Wow, I prefer the Landslova version. Could you also talk about the physical way this is being presented? I noticed that the pages are being held open. How is that done? What material is used?
It's some kind of gauze, I think, or something like that. Just fine strips which have been cut out and then used to, and they're just made a knot on the other side.
Okay. People always wonder about these things.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, of course, these are fragile books. They're treated respectfully.
Yeah.
Sometimes people wonder, why are they doing that?
It also varies quite a bit with the object how open it can be. So some of these books are very open, and some of them are just a tiny bit open. This one is kind of in the middle. Yeah. But that depends a lot on the binding and how much strain you put on the book by opening it.
I'm joined once again by my colleague and friend Johanna Katrin Friedrichsdotter to talk about the physical characteristics and organization of these manuscripts. What can you point us toward? What should we be taking an interest in as far as the organization of the manuscript?
Yeah, I mean, the striking thing, for example, about Codex Hardenbergianus is just how lavish it is, and you don't see very many manuscripts, Old Norse manuscripts, whether Icelandic or Norwegian, that are this expensive to make. There's very little gilding, and sometimes you can see that there's, for example, an Icelandic manuscript that has the same M that's in the beginning of this one, and so they're modeling it on the same copybook, but the Icelandic version is just much less lavish and sort of intricate and so on. And so here you just have more expensive ink, probably colors, etc., and the gilding. And but another thing that I think is very interesting in terms of the difference between Icelandic and Norwegian legal manuscripts is that Norwegian manuscripts most usually have a table of contents. And so at the beginning of these sections, so the law is divided into, was it 10 sections? And so at the beginning of each section, there's like a table of contents. So it says what the beginning of each chapter is. And so it just helps you find the right chapter. Whereas the Icelandic manuscripts, for some reason, usually don't do that. There's a couple of exceptions, but for the most part, they just go to the next section without kind of informing the reader, like, you know, how to find their place if they want to find the right paragraph, if they're sort of looking things up. And also like the use of the color. This is common to all medieval Old Norse manuscripts, really, that they try to have red in the sort of headings, or what we call rubrics. And so that also just helps you navigate the book. This big thorn there, I think it's isn't it a thorn? Yes. So it's a thorn. Yeah, I mean, it shows the punishment of a thief. Not a very nice punishment. Most of the time, the illuminations in this book are not as kind of, you know, harsh, really. I mean, like the beginning of the section about Leiðang, or, you know, the sort of land defense, has a very striking picture of some warriors in, you know, in the prow of a ship, and one of them is holding an axe and so on. And there's actually one section, the inheritance section, and that has 2 illuminations, even though it's technically usually considered one section, like one bolkur. So at the beginning, it sort of depicts a wedding scene, or maybe a betrothal or something like that. And then there's all this stuff about how parents, fathers and mothers, decide on their daughter's betrothal and marriage. So sort of in contradiction to canon law, church law, you know, in that law, it's the woman who's supposed to decide on who she marries, but this is sort of in contradiction to that. And then a lot of the rest of the section is how to divide inheritance and how to claim it, and there's a lot of kind of procedure, and it's quite technical and dry, really. But then there's another illumination in the middle of it, kind of.
Yeah, because usually you do find that these are used as, I mean, I think that the images are a kind of indexing point.
Yeah.
Right, it's an easy thing to identify with your eye, and an image of a thief being punished might lead you to say, oh yeah, this is the section with stuff about thievery.
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
exactly.
Is that second illustration that's in the inheritance section, is it keyed to a particular
I think it's just
section, or is it just in the middle of it?
Yeah, I mean, no, it's sort of like in the middle of a subsection, I would say. So then it sort of starts to list the line of inheritance. So if there's no sons, you know, then this happens, and then if there's no uncles and aunts, and, you know, so it just goes through like a long list of relatives, and it kind of goes all the way back to kind of like your 4th cousin, or I can't remember exactly how far back, but yeah, it's very, very intricate, and you kind of wonder, like, was this ever really used? Right. But or at least you had to be very good at genealogy.
Who made someone decide that they needed to go that far? All right, well, Albert, tell us what we're looking at now.
So this is quite a striking thing. It's a fragment from a book we called Antiphonarium Nidrosiense, which is the huge, basically a songbook. It's a liturgical book used by the cathedral in Nidaros, the seat of the archbishopric in Norway, and it contains all the liturgy which has to be performed as song. So all the hymns and prayers that you have to sing in connection to holy days, celebrating saints, celebrating other notable events in the church year. So we have it fragmentary here. We don't have the whole book, but we have some interesting fragments. It shows, among other things, the liturgy which is to be performed in connection to the holy day of Saint Olaf, which was particularly important in Norway, of course. He was both a kind of national saint. He was viewed as the kind of eternal king of Norway. And his holiday on the 29th of July was to be celebrated by singing this liturgy, which is on this page. And it also has a marginal drawing of Saint Olaf with his axe, which is his attribute, which is, I'm told by art historians, one of the very earliest depictions of Saint Olaf from Norway.
I see it here. I may be mistaken, but I think that is actually used as the cover of one of the editions of Ragnvald Iversen's Norrøn Grammatik.
Oh, really?
Which I think is the best Old Norse grammar stuff. So that's cool.
Yeah.
Could you tell me anything about the musical notation? Does it have any continuity with musical notation used today?
It does. This is an early example of medieval, or the manuscript itself is not that early, but it shows kind of the early stage of the development of musical notation, which started in the 11th century with the Italian musical theorician Guido of Arezzo, who started developing this system. So those among your audience who's familiar with musical notation today will see that there's a line missing here. There are 5 lines in the musical notations today, and the heads of the notes is also identical for all the notes. So in the mid 13th century, as polyphonal music began to develop, they started to develop the system of musical notation as well, but we don't see that in this manuscript. This has the kind of the old system.
That's a very interesting artifact for that too.
Yeah, absolutely, and the music here is it's an adaptation of music which is used in Europe for celebrating Saint Martin and Saint Dionysius as well. So this is a kind of remix of European music applied to a Norwegian saint.
Very interesting. Is the music in the exhibit based on this music, or is
it is the same music? It's a recording of that music made by a Norwegian choir.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
It just occurred to me that it might be. I can never understand choral singing. So.
No, it's not my forte either. But I think it's striking that these manuscripts provides this connection, which we are able to experience in this way, that we can actually listen to music which, if not identical, is very similar to the music that would have been sung in the Cathedral of Nidaros in the 1300s.
In a real way, you're hearing the past.
Absolutely.
So, Johanna, tell us what we're looking at here.
Here is the so-called Strengleikar manuscript. That's not the technical label for it. It's De la Garde 4-7, the shelf mark. So that this manuscript contains these poems that were translated in the 13th century at the court, the Norwegian court. We don't know exactly who translated these poems, but they must have been translated from Anglo-Norman French, because they were allegedly, at least, composed by a woman who called herself Marie de France. And she was active at the English court, where they spoke French, following the Norman invasion. So they translated these poems and a saga called Elis Saga as well, and put them in this manuscript. And people have been very interested in seeing what sort of strategies the translator or translators have in terms of taking this courtly vocabulary that they had, at the refined English court, and how do you translate like that into Old Norse? So these poems are probably from the late 12th century, sort of coming up towards 1200, and then we think that the first translations of this kind of francophone courtly literature happened in around 1230s, and then they kind of continued. And then this manuscript is likely written in about 1270. So at that point, this is sort of a well-established genre or type of literature, and
an understudied genre of Norse literature.
Yeah, understudied, although people have sort of become more and more interested in it, I would say. But for a very long time, translations were considered sort of inferior by many scholars because they didn't, this wasn't the heroic stuff about battles. And
No, I mean, well, there's no Odin in it, no Gunnar Fleetherindi in it.
yeah,
but
or Sigurd Dragonslayer.
Right.
And I mean, this one, we can at least imagine, we don't know for sure, but we can imagine that people at court, the royal court, were using this book and reading maybe out loud to each other from it, and imagining themselves as knights and ladies. And I mean, these poems, some of them are about Arthurian knights, for example, and my favorite poem in this collection is called Langval, and it's about this young knight, and he's at King Arthur's court, and he's so amazing that everyone is so jealous of him. And so he kind of gets bullied and and mobbed, and then he's sort of wandering around one day in the forest, or I can't remember, somewhere outside, and this lady comes up to him and is like, "Oh, I see that you're sad, come with me." And so this lady takes him away, and and she has this wonderful tent, if I recall, and they're sort of just hanging out there, and she gives him all the things that he wants, and then she tells him to go back to court and sort of face up to this situation. And so he does, and he comes back, and he has all the stuff that she's given her, nice clothes, and he's much more confident. I think maybe that's the most impressive gift that she's given him. And then so he's hanging out at court, and then of course Queen Guinevere is like, "Oh, he looks hot," and propositions him. And he's kind of like, "Oh, no, I couldn't possibly." And she really, really pushes it. And then in the end, he says, "Oh, I have a girlfriend who's much, much better than you." And he gets she gets very offended and has him apprehended or something. And, there's this weird scene where he has to defend himself to the entire court. And they're about to sort of punish him when his lady comes riding on a horse and rescues him, and they ride up to Avalon.
Oh my God.
And so, I think it's so interesting the way that it's the woman who's giving, the man confidence and all kinds of, stuff, and then takes him and rescues him.
While it is still firmly a medieval story. This is, you couldn't make that up today. I mean, it's still coming from a medieval cultural context.
Indeed, yeah, and it's just so funny the way that it's complete wish fulfillment, and So I'm very fond of that story, but there's lots of other interesting stories in here. There's some shape-shifting into wolves and all kinds of stuff. So it is very interesting, but I think because people who studied Old Norse in the past, they had certain expectations, and they just wanted stories about heroes who died, with a laugh, and sort of women who were proud and sort of would rather. I mean, all these people would rather die with honor and all this stuff, and this is really not the kind of modus operandi in this Arthurian universe or the courtly universe. And so, I mean, it's sort of a part of this big change, I think, that happens in at least Norwegian elite society in the 13th century, that they just start looking to Europe. They're not spending all their energy going to war with each other, and sort of, King Håkon Håkonarsson and his son, they sort of put an end to all the infighting, and there's all this stability, and so people are putting their energy into lawmaking and
Stories about wish fulfillment.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it is a very interesting period, I think, and the manuscript, as I say, I mean, it must have been in the hands of some pretty noble people, I guess, in the 13th century. And then we don't really know very much about its provenance, but because it's so, it's in such good condition relatively to something like the Hakon Saga manuscript, you can kind of imagine that it was sort of, after a while, maybe people, were not that interested in these texts anymore, and so it was sort of sitting, in the library of the court or something like that, and then eventually it ends up in Sweden in a collection there, and so that's where it's come from for this exhibition.
As a meta question about the exhibition, most of these manuscripts or some of them belong to the National Library, right? But most of these are from elsewhere.
Yes.
Isn't that right?
Yeah. We borrowed them, and so these institutions the Royal Library in Copenhagen, the Royal Library in Stockholm in Sweden, the Library of the University of Lund and University of Uppsala, and the British Library, and then the National Archives here in Oslo have lent us objects. We have a few of our own items in this exhibition, but this is a little bit of a similar situation, or very similar to the situation in Iceland, where for both Norway and Iceland, Copenhagen was the capital, and Iceland and Norway were kind of just regions of this big kingdom. And so when people become interested in collecting manuscripts, sort of beginning in the 16th century a little with humanism, and then really taking off in the 17th century, and that kind of goes together with there were wars between Denmark and Sweden, and they were kind of trying to establish some kind of cultural, historical supremacy over each other. And then they realize, all these texts, they're in these old manuscripts, and so they're suddenly interesting. And so they're going around collecting them both in Norway and in Iceland, of course. And so that's how Norwegian manuscripts end up in these other institutions. So they've been very generously lent to us. And for most of them, it's the first time that they've been in Norway for several hundred years.
That's a curious thought. How long does the exhibition go, by the way?
14th of September.
Okay, so still quite some time.
Yeah, lots of time left to see. And hopefully it's just the beginning.
Yeah. Well, what are we looking at over here?
Yes, this is the so-called Codex Hardenbergianus, or the Rantzau book, and it contains the Gulatingslov, or the law code for Gulating, which was one of the regions in medieval Norway, one of the sort of legal districts. And it's a completely unique book. And if we didn't have it, we wouldn't have this text. And it's not very big, and it's in very good condition. And it has these nice red and green initials, as you can see. And it's from about 1250. And it's probably written in Bergen or somewhere on the west coast. Probably wasn't used a huge amount, just considering how pretty it is and how intact and pristine the pages are. There's one page missing from somewhere in the middle, and then it ends in the middle of a sentence, so it's not entirely complete. But we think that we have most of this law code from Gulating. And maybe Ole Albert wants to talk a little bit about the sort of content of the law.
Yeah, what's interesting about this, right, is that it tells us about the legal situation in Norway prior to 1274, and we don't have much source material for that. We have some fragments of the law codes from the other legal provinces. We have paper copies from the 17th century of the law from Frostating, which is like northern Norway. But this is the only complete manuscript we have of a medieval manuscript we have of these old laws, which is striking, and we can see it in the content as well. It has rules which show the more sort of old-fashioned, archaic social structure, which we don't know how far back it goes, but certainly to the 12th century, maybe to the 11th century even. There are laws here about slavery, for example, which there are no rules mentioning slavery in the Landslova. By that point, it had been it was gone for economical reasons mostly. Yeah.
That's what I was going to ask you, was if you had an example of a way that it referred.
Yeah, we one of the rules on this page, I think, or an adjoining page, deals with slaves who steal things, or specifically female slaves who steal things.
I noticed on this page it was about if a free man and a slave steal together.
Yeah.
Like, how do you punish each one?
Exactly.
These medieval concerns.
It was striking question, right?
But it's interesting to think that's already kind of an antiquated concern by the 1270s.
It is.
Yeah, probably
So
already in the 1250s.
Yeah, so by that, certainly by the 1250s, I think this is an artifact from a bygone age. By this point, slavery was very common in Norway in the 11th century, probably a bit common in the 12th century, but by the 13th century it had gone out of fashion, and not because people had become more moral probably, but because it didn't pay off anymore.
Right.
It was better to just own land and rent it out to someone than to have all the burden of administrating a bunch of slaves. So the rule here dealing with an enslaved woman who steals is quite brutal. It says that the first time she steals, you should cut off her ear, and the second time you should cut off her other ear, and then the third time you should cut off her nose, but after that she can steal anything she wants.
Wow.
Because by that point it's very apparent, I guess, when she gets near your property, that you are dealing with a potential thief.
Wow.
But it tells you something about the brutality and violence as well of this slave owning society we're dealing with here.
Yeah, and the philosophy of human nature.
We also have a fragment here of this is the Christian law section, the church law section of the Gulating, and this is quite interesting because it shows the very different nature of lawmaking which we see in the provincial laws, because here we see different kind of chronological layers of the law. There are these small red abbreviations here which tells us which part of the church law was enacted at any one time. So at some places it says OL for Olaf. That's the oldest part of the law, which is attributed to King Olaf. We don't know if he was one who actually enacted this law, but he's given credit for it. So this is Saint Olaf.
Sure.
And then we have an M, which is short for Magnus, but this is not the same Magnus. This is not Magnus the Lawmender. This is Magnus the Fifth. He was king in the late 12th century. He was mostly a child when he was a king, so his reign is run pretty much by his father. But he and in cooperation with the church introduced a new church law for Gulating. So here both chronological layers are marked.
Yeah, I can just add to that this fragment also sort of shows, people are trying to date laws, as often as far back as in general, people are trying to date texts, Old Norse texts, as far back as they can. They try to push back because they're trying to seek some kind of, original, and they want to know what things were like as far back as we can. But the sources are just often not there.
Sure. And
the first written sources, here we have this fragment that many people want to say is from the 1180s, although others date it to the 13th century, first half of the 13th century. So like scholars who study paleography and so on, they don't even agree when it's from. And but even if you accept that it's from the 1180s, that's still not anywhere near St. Olaf, right? I mean, that's 1030 or so.
Right. It still looks, I mean, my impression was, wow, that's an old manuscript.
Yeah, it looks old.
I note the use of Madr, which I think of as being, I mean, I don't know that if I've seen that for, you know, the Mother Rune after much later than something like the Codex Regis, the Poetic Edda in the 1270s. And it seems like it was never very popular in Norway.
No.
But, and you know, the Win looks pretty old. The Tyronian Nota has that kind of slash form that I think of as kind of old. Like if you told me this was from, the thing is, if you told me that was from 1180, I would say, wow, that's old. Yeah, I mean, I guess I can see it. What does the F look like? Well, actually, that F is pretty Carolingian. I mean, I think of that as pretty old.
Yeah, as I say, I mean, people don't agree, and there's an edition of Gulatingslov from the 90s where they argue that this is actually younger than previously presumed.
Okay.
I haven't gone very deep into this myself.
I'd be curious what the argument is.
Yeah.
The thing is, and I mean, this is opening a can of worms maybe, but like, I don't need things to be a particular age. I just want to know. Like, I don't, it doesn't have to be old or new, but it sure looks old.
But I mean, these things develop a lot as well. And for example, with Codex Hardenbergianus that we looked at before, it used to be dated to sort of a little bit earlier than what people think now. So people thought it was sort of early 14th century maybe. And then now it's been pushed back to at least 1350, if not younger. Which is very, very young for a medieval Norwegian manuscript, at least, because this is sort of after the Black Death, and that's kind of when Norwegians stopped copying manuscripts, really. And there's just a big black hole for decades, unfortunately. Whereas the Icelanders, even though the Black Death came to Iceland, or the plague, manuscript production was halted for a while, but not as long, and so it sort of took off again pretty soon. But again, also sort of talking about the fragmentary nature of these texts. I mean, like here we're looking at a piece of a page, and so somebody's probably just been using this to reinforce a book or something like that, I mean, I think things are still turning up sometimes in bookbinding. We think that we might have fragments of medieval manuscripts in some books that we have in storage, but not Old Norse ones. But I mean, when you're working with medieval texts and producing an edition, for example, and you have one at least manuscript, if not more, that are sort of, most of the text, and then you have these fragments that have some variation, and then it's like, how do you deal with that in an edition, and how do you present that when you can clearly see that people were changing the law, they were updating it, or making legal amendments, and so. I mean, the idea of like an edition representing a legal text that is static, and that wasn't the case. I mean, there were just people were constantly amending the law.
And this very manuscript page shows awareness of that in the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
With the notation of the kings.
Exactly.
What we can also see here content-wise is kind of typical for the introduction of Christianity in Norway, because this is the rules for living a good Christian life. And we can see here that the rules supposedly introduced by King Olaf are not that strict. The fines are lower. The demands on evidence and on proof are more lax. But then when you get this updated church law with Magnus V in the 12th century, the fines are much higher, and then the demands on proof is also higher. So at the very bottom here we can see a rule which I think deals with bestiality, and here the old law says that you can disprove an accusation of bestiality if you can swear an oath with two oath helpers, two people supporting your oath. But then Magnus raises that demand, so you need 5 oath helpers instead.
Well, you know, it's like we sort of laugh, but I mean, some of our legal customs are no more arbitrary in some sense, are they?
Yeah,
no less arbitrary. Right? Amazing.
The Norse word or phrase for bestiality there is blandask vid bofie. I don't know if you can see it.
I can see the third line from the bottom.
Yeah. So yeah, it's lovely, isn't it?
But also look at that. I mean, SK for the mediopassive ending, that's old in a Norwegian manuscript.
Yeah, I mean, they still have the SK or SC as it's spelled in Gulatingslov in some places. And then in some places they have ST.
I noticed that, yeah.
And I'm not really sure what it means, if it's that the exemplar has SK and the scribe sometimes is, you know, putting ST because that's the way it's pronounced now.
Yeah.
And SK is old and then he just forgets sometimes. Or whether he has 2 exemplars and he's being super faithful.
Oh, interesting idea.
To both of them.
Interesting idea, yeah.
So
I think the first seems like a more economical explanation, but that's certainly possible. Yeah, 2 exemplars.
We'll never know.
Yeah, you know, absolutely.
No, but I think this is something that could be, you know, explored maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Johanna Ulla Albert, thank you very much for the information, for the tour of this fascinating exhibit. And from beautiful Oslo, we're wishing you all the best.